Good morning. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us. In these unprecedented times, we have pivoted to providing you with online programming from national and international speakers on the most compelling and timely topics. But we can't do this without the support of our members and our audience. If you are enjoying these talks, please consider becoming a member of the Council or making a contribution by visiting our website at lawac.org. I'm now pleased to introduce today's program. It's a new weekly series called Politics in the Time of Coronavirus with our very own politics professor, Dan Schnur. The series takes an analytical approach to the biggest headlines of the week and elevates the stories you may have missed. Dan, it's time for me to turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Kim, thank you so much for having me. And thanks to all of you for being with us today for this week's program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. I'm told that we have an exceptionally large turnout for today's program, and that's something that's very flattering. I'll do my best over the next hour to make it worth your while and to make it worth your time and attention. As Kim mentioned, we'll be going to questions from all of you about 15 minutes into today's program, and Jessica will be fielding those questions and putting as many of them as possible to me as we're able to work into the hour. One other thing we're going to try this week, though, is over the course of my opening presentation, we're going to experiment with a new polling function that's available to us. And at a couple times over the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, the amazing Claire Krelitz is going to post a couple of poll questions for you on the screen. I'll disappear mercifully, and then the questions will come up, and then you'll be able to answer on them. They're all multiple choice. Know that the responses are completely anonymous, but one of the things that we'll hope to do as we go through your questions is Jessica and I will also be sifting through the broader poll responses to the questions that we've raised. So we'll see how this works. As many of you may have seen in the invitation that went out, there are 3 topics that I'm hoping to cover today, and we'll do our best to get to all 3 of them in the kind of detail and depth that you deserve. The first is the great reopening debate. And this, when does it happen and who decides? And these are really questions that have begun to dominate the political discourse, and we'll go into those in some depth in just a minute. The second question that we'll be examining is global politics after the pandemic. In other words, on a broader world scale, how will the geopolitics of the world change? How will the relationships between the United States and other countries and other regions change as a result of the pandemic and its aftermath? And as you can probably tell by the invitation we sent out, the subtitle, The New Isolationism, gives you at least a little bit of clue into my thinking on where we may be headed on a world stage in a post-pandemic world, whenever that might be. And then our third question is our regular election update. And the question this week, for those of you who are of my generation, you'll recognize the cultural reference, is Joe Biden the Maytag repairman of the 2020 presidential campaign? Given his struggles to be seen and heard, given the overwhelming attention the media and the public are giving to this crisis. And more seriously, that last question ought to be something along the lines of, can Biden motivate his base? Because as we talked about last week, even before the Biden campaign can begin reaching out to swing voters of the types that Trump took from Clinton in 2016, the more immediate challenge for his campaign is how to get Democratic loyalists to turn out in behalf of his candidacy in November. Last week you may remember, and so we'll cover the Biden question very quickly before going on to our other 2 topics. Last week you may remember, we talked about a CNN national poll from late March that showed Biden with a very large lead nationally over Trump, but also showed that Democrats were markedly less excited about the election than Republicans were. And as all of you know, given the key role that turnout plays in any election, the relative lack of excitement among Democrats, particularly young people, particularly in minority communities, and particularly among Sanders supporters, represents a real challenge for Biden in this stage of the campaign. Anyway, so that was last week. And after we talked, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Barack Obama all endorsed Joe Biden. And all of those endorsements, of course, hopefully accomplished any number of goals in the eyes of Biden and his colleagues and his advisors. But with a primary goal, particularly the Sanders and Warren endorsements, were to motivate the progressive base of the Democratic Party. So how did it work? Well, this week there's a new Wall Street Journal poll out, and it shows Biden with a big lead, just like the CNN poll did last week. But it also shows that Democrats are still much less excited about Biden than Republicans are about Trump. So the question for us to consider is, what can Biden do to motivate the Democratic base, to convince those young people, to convince those minority voters, to convince those Bernie-crats that he is worth their time and energy come this fall? And then maybe next week, just to tease a topic for all of us to consider over the next 7 days, we can consider the maybe hypothetical question: what would it take for Joe Biden to convince Michelle Obama to join his ticket? And obviously, we can talk about those questions a little bit later in today's program. But let me go on to the other topics that I mentioned earlier. First, of course, the politics around the reopening of American society. So last week, as you remember, we discussed Trump's shift from wanting to call the shots on when that reopening would take place to a few days later, him deciding that it made more sense for the governors to make the call on whether or not to reopen and how to reopen in their own states. And part of that consideration on the president's part, I'm guessing, part of it were the constitutional questions that were raised, because these are decisions made by state governments rather than by federal governments, according to the US Constitution. But a lot of this also seemed to be the president wanting some protection in case things went bad. And the way he's been toggling over the last several days suggests that he wants just enough leeway so if a state opens up and things go well, he can share in the credit. But if things go poorly, if there is a resurgence in COVID-19 cases in a state that reopens too quickly, that he can avoid the blame. And as you may have seen, after the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, a staunch Trump ally, announced that he was going to reopen Georgia as of tomorrow, Trump admonished him for that last night, saying that he didn't think it was a good idea. But even if you take Trump out of the picture for a second, this is a wrenching national debate. On one hand, legitimate and critically important concerns about health considerations for the American people. On the other hand, equally compelling concerns about the real economic suffering that's beginning to take place in this country as long as our society remains relatively closed down. And what's happening is this debate is now manifested not just between president and the governors of states around the country, but between governors in many states and their own mayors. So in the state of Georgia, for example, Brian Kemp represents a very rural and ex-urban constituency. But the biggest cities in his state of Georgia, Atlanta and others, with much more crowded populations, are much less eager to reopen than the ex-urban rural areas are, where the concentration of people is a lot less. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Claire to post our first couple questions. Given this choice between economic considerations on one hand and health considerations on the other, we'll ask you to answer each of the next few questions, and then we'll come back to the results in just a few minutes. So where we are right now is that not just Georgia, but several states are getting ready to reopen to some degree. Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and others. The Republican states run by Republican governors. But Democrats in Western states like Colorado and New Mexico are beginning to move on this front also. And even Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, is now talking about opening up not the entire state of New York, but the upstate counties outside of New York City. But in each of those states, the big city mayors are resisting. So let's go on for just a minute and we'll come back to the poll results. So what this reflects more broadly is a growing urban versus rural divide in the United States that long predated the COVID-19 crisis. So let's go back to the last presidential campaign for some perspective on this divide between urban America and rural America. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won 87 of the 100 most populated counties in the country. 87 of the most populated counties for Clinton, 13 for Trump. And she won those counties by approximately 15 million votes. But there's just over 3,000 counties in the country. And overall, Trump won more than 2,600, more than 5 out of 6 of all the counties in the country. Hillary Clinton and the Democrats won urban America by overwhelming margins. Trump and the Republicans won rural America by equally broad margins. And so now let's come to the present and let's apply those numbers to coronavirus. What we're seeing in analysis that's already been done is that the biggest impact of the virus, by far the largest number of crises, are taking place in highly populated urban areas where people live much more closely together. New York, Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, Seattle. So here's a statistical law for you. By an almost 6-to-1 margin, there have been more coronavirus cases in counties that voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 than those won by Donald Trump. That analysis is about a week old, and the cases are beginning to grow gradually in rural areas. But you can tell by those numbers that the logistics and the proximity, the imbalance between urban and rural America, create a huge balance. A 6-to-1 margin. Clinton County has 6 times as many cases as Trump counties going back to 2016. Now, as you might suspect, this has a considerable political impact. The Quinnipiac poll shows that 37% of voters who live in large cities approve of Trump's handling of the virus. 37%, barely 1/3. A slightly larger number, 44% of voters who live in suburbs approve of Trump's handling of the crisis. But in rural America, 63%, almost 2/3 of rural voters approve of the president's approach on this issue. So now, as I said, this is a horrible, wrenching question, weighing economic considerations versus health, life and death matters. Despite the protests that we've begun to see around the country, the majority of voters, by almost a 2-to-1 margin, say that we should go more slowly. But each week, the numbers for those who want a faster opening are growing. And it's just 6-7 points a week. But the longer the country stays shut down, the number of those people who want to open up are growing. So Claire, can we post those results back on the screen again before we go on to the next topic? Are you able to put those back up again? Okay. Let's see. Do you think people who want to begin to reopen the country quickly are taking that position open for economic reasons, for partisan political reasons, or a combination of both? So by more than a 4-to-1 margin, our respondents believe that those who want to reopen quickly are doing it for legitimate economic reasons rather than just for politics. So that's a really encouraging number. How about on the health? Can we go to the next question, Claire? Let's see what we got here. Oh, that poll's still in progress, so we'll need to come back to that in just a minute. Let's hold off on those results, Claire, if you can, until we get to the question and answer part of the session. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about global politics, and then in just a little bit, we will open it up to your questions. And just as a reminder, if you send those questions to Jessica, she'll do everything she can to make sure we cover as many of those as possible over the course of the discussion today. So on the question of global politics, what's going to happen on a world scale, particularly in terms of the US's position as a world leader as a result of this crisis? And just out this morning, lucky timing for me, I think for us, there's a new report out this morning from the Atlantic Council, which I'd encourage you to look up. that lays out what they consider to be three likely post-pandemic scenarios. Scenario number one, they call the Great Deceleration. And what that scenario entails is that the United States and Europe and China all struggle to recover, both in terms of health and economically. This scenario believes that the recession will stretch well into the 2020s, primarily because it would take a lot longer for a vaccine to be developed than we've been hoping for. Now, inside of China, discontent grows, and that becomes a real problem for the Communist Party leadership. In this country, you see a real populist movement strengthening even to a greater degree. And what that means is by the mid-2020s, deglobalization is accelerating. Less trade, less immigration, less diplomatic relations between countries as we all hunker down. And that yields to slow economic growth everywhere. Poverty levels rise in the developing world. And this leads to an open potential for open conflict between the US and a China-Russia alliance. So that's scenario number one. Scenario number two is what the people at Atlantic Council call China First. And what they believe here is that the health and economic catastrophe of the first scenario impacts the United States to a much greater degree than it does the rest of the world, particularly China. What the pandemic does is it reinforces Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Communist Party's authoritarian tendencies on one hand. They become better equipped to deal with the virus because they can respond in such a heavy-handed way, in a way that we're not able to in a democracy. And what we see here in this country is the same type of America First reaction that I was referencing in the first scenario. The difference here is that the Chinese handle it more effectively than the US. So instead of this this worldwide deglobalization, we instead see Chinese capitalizing on the crisis to strengthen its ties across Asia, to undermine democracy worldwide, and to suppress dissent at home, while the US continues on a path of more nationalism and more isolationism. And so in both cases, the US struggles. The variable is how effectively China handles the crisis. The third scenario, which sounds a little bit optimistic to me, but I'd be interested in your opinions too, and we'll go to your questions in just a second. The rosiest option of the three scenarios is what the Atlantic Council authors call the New Renaissance. And that imagines what they call a V-shaped recovery, where there's not a relapse or a recurrence of increased cases. So a V-shaped recovery, and that leads to a reinvigoration of US global leadership. They envision under the New Renaissance scenario that wealthy countries come together to vaccinate everyone around the world free of charge, that China and the US set aside many of their differences because of this crisis and get to work on what they would consider a Coronis equivalent version of a Marshall Plan for developing countries ravaged by the disease. My own feeling is that third scenario, which is the one I think we'd all certainly hope for, might be a little bit overly optimistic. And I'm afraid to say, and I'll be eager to hear your thoughts as well, that a retrenchment of nationalism and isolationism, not just in the US but elsewhere, is likely to be intensified by the virus as it continues to threaten our country and others around the world. Let's do this, Claire. Let's put up the last two questions as they relate to global policy. I've offered a little bit of my thinking, but let's see what other people think as well. Number one, has the US forfeited its world leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic? Yes or no? And we'll leave that up for just a second as you consider. And then the second question will go up in just a moment. And then we'll go to the questions that Jessica's been collecting from all of you. So has the United States forfeited its world leadership role during the COVID-19 pandemic? Yes or no? And then the second question, look at that. 79% say yes, 21% say no. And so it sounds like there's a lot more of you who agree with my thought about the scenarios offered up by the Atlantic Council. Let's go to the second question now. If you answered yes to the last question, do you think the US leadership role can be reclaimed? And for the 21% of you who answered no on the previous question, we'll probably let you answer this one anyway. So we'll see those results in just a minute. But let's do this. We're 20 minutes into the program, just about on schedule. And so, Jessica, let's end the Dan Schnur monopoly on this and turn it into a conversation with smart questions and insights from our viewers and our listeners. And let's look at those last poll numbers really quickly. If you answered yes in the last question, do you think the U.S. leadership role can be reclaimed? Yes, 83%. No, it cannot, 17%. So what you guys are in the process of doing is turning me back into an optimist. So the consensus from our group today seems to be that things don't look great now, but there's tremendous potential for improvement. So Jessica, what do we got from our listeners, our viewers?
We've got a lot of questions, and a lot of these are focused on the November election and Vice President Biden. So I'll get into those. There's a rumor that Biden will withdraw before the convention. Have you, Dan, heard this? If so, who might a brokered convention nominate?
Well, I have heard the rumor, as I'm sure most of you have, because politics, like nature, abhors a vacuum. And because the presidential campaign is largely frozen, that leaves an awful lot of room for speculation. You know, the joke I made earlier about Joe Biden being the Maytag repairman of the 2020 election is one that we might have to explain to some of our younger viewers. But of course, for those of you who remember the ad, that Maytag repairman was lonely because Maytag washing machines were ostensibly made so well that they never needed to be repaired. And I think there's a lot of concern among Democratic Party regulars and potential Biden supporters that although the vice president is working very hard to make himself visible via webcam on local newscasts, on late night comedy shows, on cable TV around the country, but he's not being heard. And Jessica, I suspect that's what's leading to the rumors. What I would say, though, is barring a completely unforeseen and absolutely horrific health crisis, and I think we could agree on that regardless of political affiliation, that unless Joe Biden were, from a health perspective and a medical perspective, unable to fulfill his responsibilities as the party nominee, I can't see a scenario in which he steps down and is replaced by Andrew Cuomo or anyone else. And that leads to a discussion about his running mate. But as long as Joe Biden is healthy, he is the Democratic nominee. And for those of you who may be concerned about that, it is worth noting that despite the level of excitement, the lack of level of excitement for his candidacy that we talked about earlier, he is winning in just about every national poll.
Thank you. This is another one about him. After all the media interest in a sexual assault accusation against Judge Kavanaugh from when he was in school, why is there comparatively little media interest in a sexual assault accusation against Vice President Biden from when he was in Congress?
Well, I think most of you have probably seen this also, but it hasn't received a tremendous amount of news attention. But a former Biden staffer who previously had alleged, as had many other women, that Biden, had been in physical contact with them inappropriately. This particular woman has now alleged that he committed sexual assault against her. And it's been very interesting watching the news media wrestling with how to cover this. And my best guess, and it is just a guess, well, is the pieces I've read in the most respected mainstream news media publications, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, and so on, is that while no one is willing to say that they don't believe this woman's charges against then Senator Biden, all of the news accounts go to great lengths to point out to concerns about her story. For example, the woman said that she filed a complaint with the United States Senate, but that there's no record of it. She said that she registered her concerns verbally to senior people on Biden's staff, who said that they have no recollection of that. Now, that said, a friend of this woman's and her brother have come forward with contemporaneous accounts saying that she talked with them about these allegations at the time. But my guess is that mainstream news media has sufficient concerns about the woman's story that while they have done coverage of her charges, it hasn't been nearly as extensive as it might be if they felt that the allegations were more airtight. And because, for obvious reasons, the president and his reelection campaign certainly can't involve themselves in this conversation without being accused of the worst kinds of hypocrisy. Biden is not facing charges, or is not facing attacks, from other newsmakers on this topic, the way he might if his opponent didn't have that type of history of his own.
Okay, another one. What is the basis for claiming that Biden is weak on China?
Well, the Trump campaign, as the questioner implies, the Trump campaign in its first advertising is now referring to the former vice president as Beijing Biden. And they're talking about statements that he has made in the past about the importance of China's economic growth and economic relations with the US and the West. They've talked about his son, Hunter Biden's involvement in a company with heavy investments in China. And they reference, somewhat out of context, comments that Biden made earlier this year about the pandemic. Now, look, whether you happen to be a supporter of the president's or not, it is worth noting that for many years, for decades, leaders of both political parties in this country, including the last 5 presidents prior to Trump, 2 Bushes, Reagan, Clinton, and Obama, all maintained that strengthened economic relationships with China would push China on a stronger path toward democracy. Trump vehemently disagreed with that, and so while he made several comments early in this crisis about his relationship with President Xi and his confidence in the fact that China was handling the virus appropriately, what Trump is essentially attacking Biden for is, number one, his son's, Hunter's, relationship in a China-invested company. But second, Trump is essentially criticizing decades of US foreign policy that many of the most respected foreign policy advisors in both parties are beginning to rethink. For years and years and years, thought leaders in both parties believed that increased economic engagement with China would lead to broader democracy over there. That's less clear right now, and in a very confrontational way. That's the core of the argument that Trump's campaign is making against Biden.
Thank you. Do you believe that a stronger Democratic nominee would draw a significant number of Trump's base who support Trump's general political orientation, but very much dislike his polarizing style and leadership qualities?
So this is the question that framed the Democratic primary campaign. Many of the candidates and their supporters, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and several others, believe that the way to win back the White House for the Democrats was to motivate the Democratic base that we were talking about earlier, young people, minority voters, and other progressives. But there is a very large, according to public opinion polling, larger cohort of Democratic primary voters who say that the way to win, as the questioner suggests, is by winning back those voters that Trump took away from Clinton in 2016, primarily white working class voters. And a core part of Biden's potential appeal, given his own personal biography, is his ability to reach out to those voters. Beyond that, there's a question about the Never Trump Republicans. There's a group called the Lincoln Project, headed by John McCain's former chief strategist, Steve Schmidt, and other very well thought of Republican consultants. And the Lincoln Project is a group that has not only endorsed Joe Biden, but is running ads on his behalf. And their thought, and the thought of many other non-Trump Republicans, is that Biden is a more acceptable alternative for them than a more progressive Democrat would have been.
Thank you. I'm going to pivot away from Biden a little bit and talk a little bit more about our federal government's response and the reopening. So I'll be taking those questions. Why won't the federal government take the lead in the testing effort, both COVID-19 and antibodies? Are the states the best ones to lead if you require consistency in approach and execution?
Okay. Well, and this is a huge philosophical argument that's raging, not just in Washington, but around the country right now. Almost all of the country's governors, Democrat and Republican, are arguing that a more aggressive federal role is absolutely necessary. Trump and his administration are making the exact opposite argument. Any number of health experts in logistics efforts are siding with the governors on this one, saying that even if you are someone who generally believes in states' rights, in giving states the ability to set their own agendas, that a crisis of this nature, like a war, does require a more coordinated federal response. Trump in recent days, he's never one to admit that he was wrong, but he's begun talking just in the last few days about a broader role for the federal government in administering the testing policy. But governors on both sides of the aisle say it's not nearly enough. And if the pandemic does end up going on for some period of time, a lot of blame likely gets laid at the feet of the Trump administration for not moving on testing more quickly, because a lot of the states now, while they're working as hard as they can, are essentially competing against each other for necessary supplies and necessary equipment. As I said, it does appear that Trump is beginning to adjust his earlier thinking on this. But when this is all said and done, his timing of that adjustment, should it continue, is likely to be the subject of heavy criticism.
Do you expect that the US deficit will cause a long-term recession?
That's the zillion-dollar question. I used to say that would be the billion-dollar question or the trillion-dollar question, but we've long since broken through those barriers. I saw an interview with Stephen Mnuchin yesterday or the day before, and the Secretary of Treasury really has emerged as the key player in the Trump administration in terms of negotiations with Congress on relief issues. And he was asked the very question, as someone who is historically a fiscal conservative, a deficit hawk, if you will, was he concerned about this, about the growing expenditures and the likely deficit? And Mnuchin said he wasn't as concerned about it as he would be under normal circumstances. One, pointing to the fact that interest rates are so low, which makes borrowing much more affordable, not just for an individual or for a business, but for a government. And second, he made that what I thought was even the more obvious point, is saying in a time of crisis like this, you have to act. And any number of other smart analysts have suggested that if you don't engage more forcefully now, even given the presence of larger deficits, the cost down the line will be much, much greater. Senator McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, has indicated that now after the fourth relief package has passed, he and some of his members are beginning to get more concerned about deficits. And public opinion polling, interestingly, shows more of an even split between the two concerns than I would have guessed. A Wall Street Journal poll out just yesterday asked people how concerned they were about this federal government spending too much money or too little money on this. And the numbers are pretty even, much, at least to my surprise.
Couple of follow-up questions. A quick one, since you mentioned Senator McConnell, is there any truth that Mitch McConnell suggesting states go bankrupt in lieu of more federal aid?
Well, McConnell yesterday did say that he thought just as many private companies have entered bankruptcy as a way to regroup and regenerate and move forward, he thought that it might make sense for local and state governments to do the same thing. My own opinion, Jessica, and I don't like predictions, but my instinct on this is that McConnell's bluffing. The Trump administration has already made it clear that they believe that the next relief package should include large amounts of aid for local and state government. That's the main reason that aid wasn't included in the package being passed this week. My instinct is that what McConnell is doing is not trying to convince all 50 states in the country to go bankrupt. But when the next aid package passes, which does give large amounts of financial resources to state and local government, I think what he and a lot of Republican senators want are conditions on that aid to make sure that the money is spent on virus-related expenses as opposed to being used for the state's ongoing budget needs. So I think the bankruptcy is a little bit of a bluff. And a week or two from now, what we'll see is a debate not about whether states should go bankrupt or not, but whether federal aid to states should be limited just to virus-related spending or not. So that might be his opening proffer.
Great. And there's one more question on this deficit issue, and this is you putting on your political philosophy cap a bit. Do you believe that the idea of managing the deficit and the Democratic establishment's focus on pay-fors has finally been proven to be something of a myth? Will the post-pandemic political landscape allow for genuine expansion without these false constraints?
Okay, a little bit of a leaning, I'm guessing, on the part of the questioner. I'd offer you this: that in recent years, no more unlikely pair of individuals than Dick Cheney and Bernie Sanders have both argued that deficits don't matter nearly as much as has traditionally been the concern of most political and economic leaders. And for a variety of factors, there are increasing arguments from the left and the right that large deficits are not an impediment to economic growth, as has been conventional wisdom for decades and decades. My own feeling, and as I think most of you know, I was a Republican before I became a no party preference voter several years ago, is that I've always been a believer in fiscal restraint. But the reason you engage in fiscal restraint, and this is the argument that Jerry Brown made when he was governor of California, the reason you engage in fiscal restraint during good economic times is not just to brag about it and say, hey, look at how much money we saved. But if you can avoid deficits or build surpluses when the economy is growing, that can protect you, at least to some degree, against economic downturn. So my concern, at least personally, and as you know, Jessica, I don't like to take sides in these webinars. My own opinion, just for a moment, in this discussion, is I'm less concerned with large amounts of spending now because there's real world, real health, real economic needs that the American people face. I'm less concerned about unprecedented amounts of spending now as I am, hindsight having the benefit of being 2020, of the tremendous deficits we ran up during times of economic growth. In other words, over the last several years, we should have done a much better job as a country of limiting our deficits rather than letting them go out of control, so we could have been more fiscally prepared for today's crisis. But I don't know, even as someone who's an advocate of fiscal restraint, that now is the time to pull back the reins.
Do you think this crisis will affect our national social contract?
Boy, that's a tremendous question. It's a really, really smart question. Will this crisis affect our national social contract? The answer is yes. Every crisis does. The Great Depression led to a New Deal. World War II led to fundamental changes in the nation's economy, culture, workforce, and society. 9/11 led to overwhelming changes in the way we regard each other. If I had asked you in the year 2000, the year before the terrorist attacks, if you would ever take off your shoes to go through security in an airport, you'd have looked at me pretty curiously. And so I don't think that there's no question that post-pandemic society, whenever that comes, in many ways is going to look much, much different. And the social contract, I think, will change as well in many ways. But as is the case after the Great Depression, I think you'll see on economic and safety net related issues, a marked move to the left. And then on security issues, more of a move to the right. And we can talk about both of those topics either later today in the detail that they deserve or in a future session. But there's no question that the way we interact with each other, both through government and individually, is going to change. How can it not in a society where we don't shake hands or when we sit several feet away from our dinner companion at a restaurant?
Thank you. This is a complex question, and if you want me to read it twice, I will. Post-November elections, what composition of the three branches of federal government, President, Senate, Congress, represents the composition best positioning the United States for continued world leadership, GDP growth, and American rebooted prosperity?
Okay, so I want to make sure. So which of the three branches of government is our best hope for the U.S. to remain or once again become a global leader?
Yes, what composition of the three branches of federal government represents the best composition to position us for all those growing, growing industries of world leadership, not industries, focuses of world leadership, GDP growth, and American rebooted prosperity?
This is not me advocating for a particular election outcome, but toward that particular goal, given the candidates on the field right now, I do believe that a Democratic president and a Republican Congress are the most likely to get us there. And that's not me more broadly taking a Republican versus sides in Democrat versus Republican argument, but on the question that is raised in here, there's splits within both parties. You have an internationalist wing of both parties and an isolationist wing of both parties. As it happens, Donald Trump represents the isolationist wing of the Republican Party the same way Bernie Sanders represents that wing of the Democratic Party. As it happens, Joe Biden represents the more internationalist wing of the Republican Party, the same way some of Trump's defeated opponents 4 years ago, Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush and others, represent that wing of the Republican Party. So I wouldn't say that a Democratic president and a Republican Congress always are the best way to move a globalist agenda forward. But in this particular election, given the candidate options, a Biden presidency with a very narrowly held Republican majority is probably the most likely to push us back in that direction. Because if either party has very large majorities in Congress, then those more isolationist voices get heard more. If Republicans have a large majority in Congress as opposed to a narrow one, those nationalist isolationist voices make up a much larger percentage of the Republican House and Senate caucuses. On the flip side, if Biden were to bring in with him very large Democratic House and Senate majorities, you're getting a lot more Sanders AOC individuals who, for better or worse, would be less enthusiastic about engaging on the world side. So split government in this case, Democratic president, Republican Congress, but I reserve the right to give an entirely different answer in 2024, depending on who the candidates are.
Fair enough, fair enough. Is there a poll that accurately records the electorate's view on the desire to isolate and withdraw from multilateral international organizations versus a desire to maintain international coordination and involvement?
Well, there's any number of polls that have asked questions about voters' attitudes on the United Nations, more recently on the World Health Organization. The organization that does the best job on questions like these are the Pew, P-E-W, charitable trusts. And what I can do for next week's session is come armed with more specific polling data on that question. But what I would offer is that neither Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders exists in a vacuum. I think you could argue that to a large degree, their successes in their respective parties over the last 5 years reflects growing suspicion within both parties toward those international organizations. You've heard the phrase many times over the last years that Donald Trump is as much a symptom as a cause of any number of political and policy outcomes. I don't think that Sanders or Trump created the sentiment. I think they're both benefiting from it. And maybe next week we can dig a little bit deeper into public opinion polls to show when and how voter attitudes on these organizations has shifted.
Thank you. Traditional conventional wisdom is that authoritarian regimes like the USSR and China have disasters and famines that are caused or accentuated by political considerations trumping science and truth. To what extent are we seeing that in the United States?
Well, I think to some degree we are seeing that in the United States, not nearly to the degree that you would in a country like China or the current Russia, former Soviet Union. But it does appear, and there was an excellent article in this morning's Washington Post on this, about how, with the notable exception of Dr. Deborah Birx, most of the most prominent scientific experts in this administration are having a difficult time having their voices heard. Now, what Dr. Fauci has pointed out correctly is that when he and Dr. Birx have gone to Donald Trump, and not just to offer their assessment, but to offer strong opinions, particularly as it relates to reopening, that the president has taken their advice. But the Post argues in a fairly persuasive way that throughout government, the voices who would have the most prominent role in these discussions aren't being heard. But I think it would be much more alarmist than I'm willing to be at this point to begin to equate a president who favors economic advisors over health advisors under many circumstances to the way that a country like China or Russia approaches these types of considerations.
Are any other world leaders speaking to their electorates daily in televised briefings like Trump is doing?
The key phrase in that question is like Trump is doing. And of course, the answer is no, because I can't think of another leader on the world stage who, even if they were holding televised briefings, would be holding them precisely the way that our president is. It appears to me that most of the leaders of the Western democracies have come to the decision that less is more. And Merkel, Macron, even Boris Johnson, before he fell ill, appeared in public talking about this crisis at particularly critical moments, and left it to advisors to offer the more, for lack of a better term, logistical information. On one hand, Trump seems to be benefiting from his approach. He's not able to go out and have the very large-scale rallies that have characterized his previous campaign and his presidency. He's not able to go out in front of tens of thousands of people, taking advantage of that news media platform to have his message delivered. It appears that he does benefit to some degree from the hour and a half, 2-hour sessions he does each night. And the Wall Street Journal poll that I mentioned earlier, just out yesterday, shows that while the balance between positive and negative ratings on Trump on this crisis are worse than the same ratings on Biden, that Biden and most other political leaders simply aren't being heard by the sheer omnipresence of the president. That said, the fact that he's on television every night and is often engaging in political debate rather than the provision of necessary information has caused the president's poll numbers to drop. We talked a few weeks ago about the rally round the flag effect during a crisis when the American people will turn to support their leaders. And a few weeks ago, we saw that President Trump's poll numbers had gone up by a notable margin as a result of this. They've now gone back to where they were before the crisis. And if you look back at past examples of this rally around the flag effect during war, during depression, during other times of national crisis, generally the president enjoys that heightened level of support for much longer periods of time than Trump has. There's a case to be made that while Trump is crowding Biden out of the discussion, that it has harmed his overall favorable ratings with the American public.
Thank you. We saw some of those tweets yesterday about how Trump wants us to respond to Iran. And so I think that's probably partly what inspired this next question. What are the risks of nations falling into major wars in the time of coronavirus? What would war in the time of coronavirus look like? And I think that'll be our final question because we are running out of time.
Why? And it is an excellent question to end on. It appears to me that both the president and his Iranian counterparts are facing a lot of heat domestically from voters in their respective countries. Voters who are very dissatisfied both in the US and in Iran with how their nation's leaders are handling this crisis. And for both the United States and Iran, there's something to be said by perhaps distracting the public by engaging in some fairly bellicose language and rhetoric. Now, to be fair to the president, it has been documented by international observers that Iran's Navy is being much more aggressive and much more provocative in approaching US vessels. And it is appropriate for a US president, commander-in-chief, to respond to that. But to the broader question, can a time like this lead to international peril? And the answer is, of course it can. And I'd say, if you look back to the period after World War I, when the US then, like now, is beginning to look more inward, we were so focused, understandably, on the domestic impact of a Great Depression that we stopped paying nearly as much attention to the rest of the world. And of course, while we were focusing on our own dire economic circumstances, the Nazis were rising in Germany, Tojo and his allies were rising in Japan, and even though our allies around the world were asking for more US engagement, we were either unwilling or unable to provide it, given the Depression. And so I do worry, coming back to one of the topics we began today's conversation with, that we become so understandably focused on the coronavirus and its impact for all the most appropriate of reasons, that it does perhaps allow our leaders to take their eye off of the world stage. And it does present opportunities for China to advance in the South China Sea, for Russia perhaps to move more aggressively in its former sphere of influence. The Iran response might make sense, but more broadly speaking, a crisis of this scale and scope does provide an opportunity for global bad actors to begin to move more aggressively. And it is something that this president or his successor is going to have to pay attention to in the years ahead.
Thank you so much, Dan. I think Kim is going to join us. So I hope all of you that were on today will join us next Thursday. And Kim, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Dan, as always, for a very informative discussion. And thank you to our viewing audience for joining us today. We have 3 terrific live streams for you next week. First, a panel of global health experts who will be sharing what you can expect with the next phase of COVID-19. We also have another partnered event with the World Trade Center, which will be on how tech and manufacturing are pivoting their businesses to protect people. And of course, we have Dan's weekly news series on politics in the time of coronavirus. For your convenience, we've provided a handout for you that you can access on your control screen that lists all of the upcoming programs, and we hope you will register for them today. Stay safe, stay informed, and see you soon. Thank you, everybody.